Give us a moment. The recording thing is not turned red yet, so.
Oh, mine has over here on this end.
Oh, there, mine goes. Great. Hey everyone, my name is Chris Haas. I'm a second and third grade teacher in Richland School District 2 and also a Midlands area rep for SE for Ed. And tonight we are here to interview candidates running for Senate District 23 in November. And we actually have one of our candidates here tonight. The other candidate, Katrina Shealy, running on the Republican ticket as the incumbent, is going to meet with me at a later date. So we'll actually have two different videos. So in this video, we have the candidate running on the Democratic ticket, which is Bill Brown. So Mr. Brown, if you wouldn't mind, maybe take a moment, introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your platform and why you're running for office.
Sure. My background is frankly, I'm retired at this point. I've spent more than 30 years in the computer industry, if you will. I was retired from the IT department at Southeastern Freight Lines. My specific area of expertise is telecommunications with heavy trucks, the electronics and heavy trucks, if you will. I still do a little consulting at Southeastern, and I do a little consulting for a firm in Atlanta. I am not a politician. One time, 40 some odd years ago, I was on village council in a place in Ohio. That's where I'm from, Ohio. I moved here 16 years ago, but I was on village council for about 2 years. I was an unopposed write-in candidate. I got elected with 6 votes. So I am not in any stretch an experienced politician. Why I'm running? Well, I really believe every one of us deserves the best effort on the part of anyone who represents us. And when I saw that Katrina Shealy was unopposed, it just struck me as, well, she has done well. Frankly, I voted for her when she was up for election against Jake Knotts. But I believe everyone benefits from a bit of competition. So I'm offering her, if you will, a bit of competition. What I can offer other people, I am a very, very good analyst. Anyone who knows me can attest and would attest to that. I can dig into a problem and try to come up with alternative solutions, looking at every angle I could possibly look at. I guess that's about it from a background perspective, Chris.
Okay. So my first question of the evening is, and I know this question might feel a little different now because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And although we're recording this in July, some people won't be watching it until closer to November. So we should keep that in mind also. But
Okay.
know that I'm asking this question in the midst of a pandemic, and you can touch on that if you want, but it's also a more general question about education. When you look at the state of public education in the state of South Carolina, what strikes you? What are some things that you notice? What are some things that maybe you celebrate, but also things that you're concerned about?
Well, when I first moved here 16 plus years ago, I heard a term that rattled me a bit. And so I drove around to find it. It was called the Corridor of Shame. And I drove through it. What struck me is the dramatic difference from one school district to another. I mean, it's just not a little different. It's dramatically different from one to another. I don't know the solution to that because I don't know exactly the funding technique and methodology that's defined by regulation, if there is one. But I think that the funding itself is got to be examined. How it's allocated, is it sufficient? South Carolina has an exceptionally low, and I know people are going to think I'm crazy, an exceptionally low real estate property tax. I live in a house that is substantially more expensive than the one I had in Ohio, and I'm paying 1/4 of the tax on that. Now, in Ohio, the schools were primarily funded through real estate property taxes. Now, I know that here in South Carolina, you also have a property tax on your automobile, your pickup truck, or whatever, but and it's substantially higher than that in Ohio. But I'm just wondering if there isn't some better way to fund what I see in many areas of the state as an educational opportunity being missed, an investment that's not being made. I don't believe funding schools is an expense, it's an investment. Retention, I've heard about that in the last couple of years, more so than before, retention of quality teachers. And I thought I'll toss in here, my wife is a retired school teacher. She taught in Ohio for 30 plus years, mostly first grade, but some learning disabilities. And for the last couple of years was in what they call pre-first. I have a dinner table background, if you will, spanning 30 years of listening to her reactions to things that occur in the school. And I think some of that is perhaps what concerns me right now in terms of COVID. But back to the retention issue, the wages here in South Carolina, apparently, from everything I've read, they're substantially lower than surrounding states. And if that's true, certainly we need to adjust in that regard. It's one thing to be lower than New York City and lower than California, but we're not close to New York City and we're not close to California, so we don't need to compete with them, but we do need to compete with North Carolina and Georgia. Results. And by that, how do we make sure we're getting what we need to get from our investment in education, we being the voters? I think that does matter. How do we measure it? Testing is fine. Is that the proper way? Is that the only way? Is there a better way? How do we define who's responsible for what portion of the educational achievement, if you will, for a child? There's a certain parental responsibility, and there's a responsibility on the part of a teacher. There's a responsibility on the part of frankly, the government. They have to be certain that things are in order and proper. Those are, I guess, some of the issues. The internet availability in the outlying areas. I know there are some areas of South Carolina that don't even have a cell phone signal, let alone if they don't have cell phone, the likelihood of them having a high speed or reasonably high speed internet access is questionable. And now, today, I mean, it was unheard of. I went to grade school in the 1950s and 60s. We didn't have computers, surprise. But now, so much of what goes on in the classroom is done even at the lower grade levels on a computer of some sort. Not all, but a lot of it. And I think we need to figure out a way to somehow or another get that access out into those rural areas. I don't know how to achieve that off the top of my head. Phone companies aren't going to run cable and put towers where they can't get a return on their investment. Perhaps we need to consider something along the lines of, if someone has qualifies for free lunch, they might qualify for a subsidy on their internet if it's a question of rather than availability, if it's a question of affordability. Gosh, what else? Back to the current situation, COVID, if you will, the virus. I'm all in favor of seeing kids get back into a classroom. I believe that the classroom experience is much, much better than an online experience. I mean, right now, right, my computer isn't operating the way it should. I can't see you, so I'm looking at a blank screen. But even if I weren't looking at a blank screen, an online environment is tough. Not as good an experience. Now, at least with the proposals I've heard in the last several weeks, We have a demand from the governor that he wants 5 days a week in school attendance. Plus, for those parents who choose not to send their children to the classroom, he wants online. Well, I don't know how to achieve that either. How does one? I used to teach an adult education class many years ago. I stood in that classroom. I walked around in that classroom. I can't stand or sit in front of a camera or the whole school day. Could you imagine that? And actually teach anybody anything that was there in the classroom. To me, it's one or the other. Either you can provide online environment, or you can provide it in person, or you're going to need double the staff. One person can't do both simultaneously, in my opinion. Not well, anyway. In addition to that, we have the other situation of when children get into the classroom with this virus. How many? I just remember my wife coming home, and she would talk about all the sniffling and the sobbing and the hugging and the fun part most of the time of the classroom with kids. How does a school teacher in that environment protect him or herself? We're told to socially distance from one another. Does that mean that every child will be required to wear a mask? Or if not, oh, somebody just sent me something that said you can't hear me anymore.
I can hear you.
Is that correct? Okay. All right.
Okay.
That's funny. That's all right. So how does that teacher protect him or herself from children if they're not required to wear a mask? Or is it parents that don't want their children to wear a mask must then instead send them to online classes? No matter how many children are in the classroom, that classroom wasn't designed for socially distancing those kids. Maybe we're not concerned about passing it from child to child, but when that child gets home, whatever they were exposed to in that classroom is going to now expose everyone in their home. And the teacher would be exposing his or her spouse.
Well, and that's a concern of ours. We sent out a survey, and we have a little more than 30,000 members in our organization. And from that survey, 7,700 responded. And of those 7,700 who did respond, 40% of them had at least one condition that put them at higher risk for the virus. So I'm thinking of myself as a second, third grade teacher. I love my kids to death, but they saturate their collars and their sleeves with their saliva. They sneeze and cough all over everything. Some of them still suck their thumbs, and then they use things that other people use. So I gotta be honest, I'm so desperate to get back to school, but that idea frightens the heck out of me because my 72-year-old mother lives with me, and she has other health issues, and I'm fearful for what I might bring back home to my mom, not to mention myself or my kids, but especially for my mom. So absolutely. So you touched on a lot of things, which is absolutely wonderful. So my second question is one of priorities. If you were elected, what would you want to make your first priority?
Because the election is only a little over, 2 months away, 3 months away, a little over 3 months away, I would say COVID is still going to be with us. And I would say how we're dealing with that virus in our educational system would be our number one priority for anyone. Has to be. I cannot imagine that the vaccine will be distributed. It might be available by then, but it won't be fully distributed by then. So that would be number one.
Okay. So you mentioned, you talked a little bit about budget earlier, and my third question was a little bit about funding education. So education used to be funded through property taxes. And some groups of people, primarily people on the coast, were unhappy with that, and we shifted it. So it got shifted to becoming a piece of the sales tax. And then 2008 hit, and then things unraveled pretty quickly. So in South Carolina, our schools have been underfunded the last 12 years in a row, currently by about $600 per child. I can give you some examples. In my school, we don't have a librarian. We don't have a full-time nurse. We're a wonderful school who does wonderful things for kids, but we have things that aren't met because we don't necessarily have the funding for it. So if we know that we do need to address funding in some way, because you mentioned it's not as much an expenditure as much as it's an investment, how do you think we could go about addressing funding in a way that wouldn't break our state, but would also respect the responsibility that we have to our children and to our futures as well?
I think we need to. I was here in South Carolina for about 1 year before that transition occurred. My property tax in the house that I live in here went from, I'm going from memory, from $1,200 a year, which was still a fourth of what I paid in Ohio for a lesser home. It went from $1,200-ish a year down to $900-ish a year. I think it's time to reevaluate that balance. Yes, I recognize that sales taxes went up. Guess what? Sales tax here isn't any higher than it is in Ohio. So leave the sales tax where it is, but start looking at least bringing back some portion of the real estate property tax. I mean, I'm retired, and I'm going to tell you, we need to pay a little more. We need to invest a little more. It's not an expenditure. It's an investment in our kids and grandkids. I'm not adverse to saying maybe we have a combination of real estate property tax goes up by 1/3 of what it went down by, but we condition that based on income levels so that someone, because South Carolina's per capita income is substantially lower as well than Ohio, some people might not be able to afford an extra $100, for example, in a 12-month period. For some people, that $100 is a make or break. Well, then maybe we, instead of bringing back 1/3 of it, which would, in my example would be $100, we bring back a little better than 1/3 of it so that we can afford to give credit to those people that truly cannot afford to pay that extra sum of money. I don't have the full solutions because I don't have all the data. How much did it really go down? How much did it really go up? Was it really truly a swap? And if it was a swap from 16 years ago, has it gone up by at least 3% per year or 4% per year, whatever the inflation rate was? I doubt that. I doubt that.
Yeah.
And you know what really confused me is in the most recent 12 months, I seem to recall somebody in the state mailed me a check because they had a budget surplus.
Yeah.
But we have schools, yeah. I've seen pictures of schools whose roofs are leaking.
And with school buses that are 50 years old. Yeah.
Yes. But we have a budget surplus. Well, if we had a budget surplus, we should have invested it rather than, for sheer vote getting, give it back to the taxpayer. Yeah. Guess what? The taxpayer had already paid it. It was a windfall to the taxpayer to get it back. And instead of a windfall to them, it should have been a windfall to our budgetary needs, period. Sorry.
So I will say, I'll move on to your last question, but kind of related to that. We've been working on this for some time. We kept hearing, well, if you can find the money, we'll spend it. But the money is just not it. So this past year, pre-COVID, you might recall that our state was projected to have a $2 billion surplus, $800 million of which was recurring. So we were pushing, if we were already underfunded by a little more than $600 per student, here's our opportunity to address funding in our schools. And with the $2 billion or the $800 million recurring, they increased it $11 per child. So it can't always be we just don't have the money or we don't want to burden the taxpayers, because when we do have the money, we haven't made that choice either. So for those of us who work with
Right.
children, it's just heartbreaking because we know it's capable and we know what wonderful things already happen, but we'd sure love to create better conditions for our kids. So my last question is going to go to another topic. You hinted on a little bit earlier, but you mentioned testing a little bit.
Hmm.
And I know you're not an educator. Your wife's an educator, but you're not an educator. So sometimes these discussions or these topics might be a little more challenging. But you could also talk about if you were posed with these sorts of questions, how would you find out what you need to find out to make decisions on them? So my final question is: we hear a lot about testing and the stresses of testing and the effects that it has on not just one day of the school year, but maybe a month or maybe the whole of the school year, thinking about these tests that are coming up. Um, how do you think, as a state, we should determine if our schools are being successful, or if our teachers are being successful, or our students are being successful? What are the measures that we should be looking for, in your opinion at least, that the state should be looking at to determine the success rate of education and students in our state?
I do want to clarify, I have no problem with testing, but
Okay.
anything can be taken to an extreme. I'd like to know more about how much testing really goes on. I'd like to know more about what those tests are like. It's been years. Frankly, I was a student. We had to take tests. We back then they didn't call them state mandated, although they were. In the 1950s and 60s, we took IQ tests, for example.
So
I still,
I'll jump in and I'll give you an example. So in our state, a lot of times we give awards for things. So some schools receive awards based on their testing data. Some of those same schools plan to teach through the third quarter of the year, and then they shut down their teaching and they spend the last 9 weeks doing nothing but preparing for that test, giving kids all these worksheets and so they can nail that test. And for educators, a lot of times we'll talk about there's a difference between achievement, like a score on a test, and
yeah,
learning that makes you successful in life, because there are many skills that are involved in. So, so I can see where you're coming from, because you're talking about, well, we do need measures, we do need metrics, we
yeah,
need those sorts of things.
yeah,
I think sometimes when we talk about that, it's that a test isn't really just one day. Sometimes it's 9 weeks, and
yeah.
sometimes it's even more than 9 weeks.
If it's truly, as you say, to get an award, they're doing that. My comment would be then that award should be reevaluated, because instead of motivating people to do well, we're motivating them to game the system. Let's find a different way to motivate. I have no problem testing people to verify that they do have knowledge. Uh, Life skills are wonderful, but you know what? If you can't multiply your times tables all the way up through 12 times 12, come on, folks. Um, if you need a calculator to figure out 4 times 5 and you're in the 6th grade, something's wrong. So I don't have a problem with testing, but the example you gave is precisely why I suspect there is a bit of a brouhaha over testing. Let's figure out what it is we should be testing and why we should be testing it, and what it means when schools do well or do poorly. I would tell you that if a school does poorly, maybe we need to sit back and say, how do we invest differently in that school? It might not be necessarily with funds, it might be something else. How does a child learn if their air conditioner is broken in South Carolina and they're in school in August and September? I don't care who you are. When you're sweating like a pig, you can't. Maybe that's part of the issue. I don't know. I think every school district should be able to provide the state superintendent, for example, recommendations that they would have on what should be tested, how it should be tested. How do we verify that the knowledge has been learned? Again, life skills are great, but yeah, and when I think of life skills, I don't think of math and reading. I think of technical schools where they learn to take an engine apart. maybe the definition of life skills is different for you, but I want my grandchild to know what happened in the 1960s. Martin Luther King and Kennedy and the race riots and everything else. There's background there that's worth knowing. But no, to spend 9 weeks, the end does not justify the means. If that's what's going.
So, because people often refer to them as high stakes standardized testing, it's the high stakes that pressures people into doing things like that because they know their kids have to ace that one test, regardless. But so I can speak from. And do you have children?
I have 2 grown children. My daughter's a doctor, and my son has his master's in electrical engineering. Okay. I'm sorry, mechanical engineering.
So I have 4, but I know from my own childhood, there's been times where I've crammed for tests and done very well in the test. But if you'd asked me 3 weeks later, I don't know what I would have told you. But yeah, so assessment, obviously, super important. Hey, thanks so much. I wanted to end with an opportunity. Is there any other topics, any other things you'd like to reach out and communicate to potential voters in your district ahead of this election?
One thing, and that is vote. I don't care if you vote for me or if you vote for Katrina, but for gosh sakes, get out and vote. And especially in the presidential election. I don't care who you vote for, but for gosh sakes, vote.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us and helping voters in your district become more informed, because we certainly want people to vote, and we want people to work hard at making sure they're making informed votes as well. And certainly we help tonight. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity, and I'm sorry I had to use a telephone and my screen is blank, but such is life.